We are so excited this month to welcome Hillary Kwiatek from Lehigh University. And this month, we are speaking about why employee stories matter. Corp- Corporate Podcasting Smarter is brought to you by Podbean. We're a podcast hosting and monetization platform and have an incredible enterprise solution that many higher education institutions and large corporations and organizations utilize for podcasting. So, Hillary, we are so excited for you to join us today and speak about Lehigh University's podcasting initiatives and your show, The Spotcast. Hello and welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me. I was so delighted when you invited me to be here.
Absolutely. So, podcasting for universities is something that just, intuitively makes so much sense. So, before we dive in, tell us a little bit about your role as an employee communication specialist, which we couldn't quite fit into your tech, and Lehigh University's podcast, The Spotcast.
Sure. So I've been at Lehigh for almost exactly 12 years. My anniversary was last week. And I've been the employee communication specialist that whole time. It started as a part-time position, and I wrote a monthly newsletter that still went out in print to some 28 of our employees who simply refused to read it in their email. And then we had a benefits allocation review going on. So that was the full extent of my job. But pretty soon into it, they said, we want to innovate. We want to be better at this. And they kind of let me go and do whatever I wanted. So I started some social media. We transferred our newsletter fully digital. Those 28 people, I think, have retired by now. But they just had to get over it and read the newsletter online. And my job also has a dotted line to university communications. I work in HR. I sit in HR. So also got involved in work there. And then we started doing employer branding, really looking at hiring more as talent acquisition. I started doing video. We got more and more into that. And I think just sort of as a natural progression from all of that, I pitched a podcast to my boss saying, at the end of every interview I do for an article or for a video that's only 3 minutes long or 600 words, I have all these other great stories from this person, and they're fascinating. And I think more people should get a chance to hear them. And so I managed to get an intern because I have no budget. And the two of us put our heads together and we launched the Spotcast before the pandemic. So in fall of 2019 is when we started it.
Yeah, absolutely. And for everybody out there listening, this podcast is a beautiful show that Hillary produces with, the spirit of community at Lehigh University, which is so great because you're hearing the employee stories, and each episode really highlights a different employee and what they do at the university, how they got there, what department they're in, what degrees they got to run that department and how it all fits together. But you also hear about their human story, right? You hear about their journey as a human being and how they got this odd job that led to this other thing that led to something else that led to somebody seeing them sing at a Christmas party, to being invited to be part of a play in South America with a theater group. Like, it's so interesting because a lot of the time I think in our careers, things aren't linear and there's a lot of pressure to explain that in a linear way. And what you do is you really celebrate how non-linear our careers can be, especially within education. A lot of experience that people within education and universities have is that lived experience, and it's not always a perfectly straight line.
You put it so well, and I think that with each episode that I've recorded, it has confirmed for me that we need to tell these stories because people are worried about gaps in their history or weird offshoots that they've taken, and folks need to know that it all, when you look back, it all kind of lines up. Oh, this is where I was headed. So yeah, the stories Mark Wilson told in his interview, the head of Zollner Art Center, our performing arts center, he taught us such a great lesson in there where he said, I learned how to just say yes and figure things out after that. Like if someone else saw something in me that I didn't see in myself, I needed to examine that. I needed to take that chance and see if I can see it in myself as well. And that's how he ended up going from, the only Black kid in his school in Iowa to, international opera stages, and now to be running a large performing arts organization. And so, yeah, each of the interviews has been like that, and I always come away amazed. I love conversation. I love to talk to people. I love to listen to people's stories. So the way that this podcast kind of evolved is very much in keeping with just kind of my approach. It is, I guess, in a way, a very personal podcast for me in that sense, even though it's um, ticking a lot of boxes for us from an employer branding and an employee relations perspective.
Absolutely. And when you think about, the brand of an employer, that brand is really made up of people, right? And,
Totally, totally.
and people are human and sometimes messy and sometimes, don't have traditional career paths, especially within the arts. Things can be, very A to Z to B to F to G to X to M. So
Yeah,
it's something where, showcasing and highlighting those stories, I think, really brings each person into the mosaic of the university brand as a whole. And it's so beautiful and celebratory of all the different kinds of people that it takes to create the community that a university is.
absolutely. And we've interviewed the chief of police and our director of learning and development. I've interviewed one of our employees who runs our fab lab, sort of our fabrication lab, teaches students how to do 3D printing and use, welding and sort of really
Yeah,
hands-on tools. And these are students who are, maybe engineering majors and have never touched a tool in their lives, and they come to a 4-year private, distinguished institution where you don't think they're teaching you welding, but they are.
right.
And he started his work fabricating theater sets, and now he runs this
Yeah.
whole program, and is a woodworker. So he's building furniture out of trees that fell on our campus during a hurricane. Um, it just goes on and on like that, and I get excited for it every time I get to sit down in the studio with somebody.
Absolutely. And I feel like a large part of HR, and we're going to get into more of, the benefits and the responses of the podcast, but a large part of HR, I think, is in celebrating those stories of the people that create an organization. So it's just been so beautiful to listen to the podcast. We love it. And,
Thank you.
within Lehigh University, what are some of the benefits that you've seen, and what has the response been within the employee population?
So I think that that's one of the great things about doing employee communications is anytime I drop a piece of content, whether it's a podcast or an article that features somebody, I hear back from that employee, that they are hearing from their fellow employees. I never knew that about you. Congratulations on your master's degree. Um, you know, or your transfer, your promotion, whatever it is that they're reading about. Um, and so most of the feedback that I get is via the interviewees. And I
Yeah.
love that. And then a lot of times they will post it on their social media, share it with their networks of folks outside of the university. And I will see that on their LinkedIn pages. I'll see that if we're connected on Facebook, just people congratulating them, celebrating them. So I think that one of the big benefits is to that person themselves, getting some credit, getting some exposure. And it's one of the ways I pitch it to them when I want to interview them. I'll say, this is great exposure for you professionally on
Yeah.
campus. You'll get to meet people. Um, and then, I can use snippets of it. I can use it in our social media to reach our employees and to reach potential employees, because all of our social media is external social media. We don't have anything that's walled off,
Mhm.
no intranet or anything like that. And these podcasts are out on Spotify and
Yeah.
all the major podcasting services. They're not walled. They're on Podbean publicly, so I can use them in other things that I do. But yeah, I love hearing from both the people who work with the interviewee, but also people just from random parts of the university that will say, I was listening to this on my drive home and I heard this story. I had no idea about this person. It's I can tell that it's reaching people on a human level and building community. And given the fact that I had only released a couple of episodes before the pandemic, and every episode since has been released during the pandemic, I think that it's had an important impact on people in that sense. Being able to feel connected and listen to colleagues' stories as well.
Absolutely. And for everybody watching live, the link for this podcast is here, so you can click it later and all of that. So don't worry, we've got you covered. And if you do have any questions, you can drop them here in the chat. And Hillary, it's so interesting because I think on a human level, right, having that acknowledgement of I see you, I want to hear your story, you're a vital part of our organization, and working with employees one-on-one about how they fit into the mosaic that is the community um, must be so rewarding. And I think from specifically the employees that you've spoken to and whose stories we've all heard, it's something where I could totally imagine, everyone around him is like, wow, your journey is incredible, because I think everyone has a story. And so it must really help build that perspective within maybe their own department, but the university as a whole, to highlight the different journeys that everyone has.
Absolutely. And I would interview everybody if I could. I would kind of line them up outside of the studio. And we're very fortunate that our library and technology services had the foresight to build a small digital audio studio specifically
Yeah.
for audio. And I don't know that they really envisioned podcasting for this studio. I think they thought that professors would use it to record lectures and things like that. But I said, hey, I just raised my hand and said, can I use it for a podcast? And they, again, the community and the culture of our library and technology services is very innovative and open, and they love seeing people take their tools and use them for new things. So just making the podcast itself was another way to build community.
Absolutely. And, I could go into libraries because I also love libraries. But, as we move toward a time where I think, a lot of books are digital, libraries are becoming more and more community centers. So how fantastic
Absolutely.
is it that Lehigh's on the forefront of that, with offering community services within the Lehigh community on, podcast production or even a studio setup? That's fantastic.
Mhm. Mhm.
How has the podcast been part of your larger HR strategy of creating the community that Lehigh has? And how does it play into your overall communications to promote the university?
That's a great question, and probably not one that I totally thought through when I decided to create a podcast. But in retrospect, it fits into a strategy of having different points of contact and types of content to reach people in a lot of different ways. So we are very much about meeting our employees where they are.
Yeah.
We've surveyed them and we know what they want, sort of how they want it to a certain extent. And one of the things we know is that when something's super important, they just want an email, right? That they're like, if you put it
Right.
in my email box and it says important, they know, okay, I gotta, read this, whatever. But then they also want, short videos, photo galleries, short, articles, and then they want longer form articles and, longer things. And so the podcast is probably the longest thing that we do.
Yeah.
Each episode's between 20 and 35 minutes, depending on the conversation. And so it's sort of on that spectrum of from I only have a minute to I have a 45-minute commute. It's on
Yeah.
that end of it, and really giving people the chance to dive in. We try to, again, tell career journey stories
Yeah.
in a lot of different ways. Every year we do an article about employees who earn their graduate degrees at Lehigh. We get free tuition for graduate degrees at Lehigh for employees and for
Mhm.
their dependents. And every year there's 6 to 12 employees who are earning a master's or even a doctorate. And so I always do an article and post, go to commencement
Yeah.
and follow them around put them on social media and things like that, celebrate them that way. People love that. But then one of those people might be on the podcast and they'll get to hear a lot more about them. So in terms of where it fits in, it's a deeper dive. So I don't have expectations that, all 1,800 of our employees are going to listen to every episode. But that's where it fits in. And then again, like I said, it's part of that employer branding piece for the external communication strategy, where we're letting people know what it's really like to work at Lehigh and who your
Absolutely.
coworkers would be.
Yes, absolutely. And, on the podcast you mentioned, we're currently hiring. And I think it's such a great way to showcase what the culture is like, how fulfilled people are in their roles, what lights them up, what brought them to Lehigh, what kind of got them there in terms of the progression of their careers. And a little bit of that getting to know you. So I think
Mhm.
that's so important, especially from an external standpoint as well. And internally, I mean, I think yeah, just having that segment of showcasing the specific experiences that the employees are having at Lehigh University, because when people think of a university, I would say top of mind, the population you think of first is students, right?
Yeah.
But there's a lot of people who run a university and make it happen, right? So
That's a really great point, and I should say that one of the struggles that you have when you're doing talent acquisition for staff at a
yeah,
university is that people assume that the only people who work at universities are faculty, and we don't do faculty hiring in HR. That's done by the colleges and the deans and the provost and all of that.
right.
So
By the
they handle
faculty,
that.
right.
Yeah,
Yeah,
they handle that. And so what we're really telling are the stories of staff members. And so just by telling stories of staff members, we're also sharing that information that we hire staff members. In fact, it's
yeah,
kind of a 2-to-1 ratio. We have about 1,200 staff and 600 faculty. That's pretty typical for a university.
yeah,
And so you're right. This year, especially with the Great Resignation, I mean, we're not immune. Every organization is going through a big
yeah,
upheaval in terms of turnover. We're
yeah,
going to be doing an even bigger push with putting money towards advertising and things that we haven't had to do in the past. But so I added that little promo at the beginning of the podcast this season that just says, if you like what you're hearing, we're hiring. Go to this website and look at what we've got available, because if someone's listening to this podcast, maybe they'd like to work at Lehigh. That's the hope.
yeah, absolutely. And like you mentioned, people who are featured on the podcast who get to share their story, who feel seen and a part of the community at Lehigh are going to share it, right? And so everyone in their community, maybe who have had parallel experiences that are valuable to Lehigh, are going to see it as well. So it's definitely a fantastic promotion tool in that way as well. And in terms of employee morale, right?
Mhm.
Like to feel like your story matters, to feel like you know, your story is a vital and important part of what makes your workplace and community what it is, I think is so important.
I think so too. And there aren't a lot of places where staff stories are centered, right?
Yeah.
If you look at most of our external communications, it is about students doing great things, which is great,
Yeah.
and faculty doing important research, which is also great.
Yeah.
But they don't tend to, issue press releases about employees who, created a new system for doing something, right? It's not That's not what the university brand is about. And I get that
Right.
because their audience is really, they're trying to bring in students.
Right.
So my job as the employee communication specialist is to really focus much more on our staff. And I think it's a win-win all around in that sense too.
Absolutely. And what are some of the most surprising things you've learned from creating this podcast? Because there are so many incredible stories. Like, it's really, and the storytelling, which we're going to get into later, is fantastic. But, like, what are some of the deep dives that have just blown you away?
Oh my gosh. So we already talked about Mark Wilson. That's the
Yeah.
most recent episode, and I think that one may have had some of the most sort of revealing and personal moments.
Yeah.
I'll just mention one more thing about that one, and that is the story that he tells of his experience as being the only Black kid at a school in Iowa, and his
Yeah.
first day at the school is
Yeah.
something that is really worth listening to, and I won't give it away because I think it's something you need to hear him say in his own
Yeah.
words. But I will say that you'll hear me go, wow, which
Yeah.
I don't do very often in the middle of an interview.
Yeah.
Um, and then I would say, Ainsley Lamberton, who is the director of administration for our research and sponsored programs, she's been at Lehigh, I think, about 14 years. And watching her over the years, and then hearing her story of how she has taken it upon herself very much to be a resource for our LGBTQ community
Yeah.
as an out professional woman, and sharing her life on a personal level as a mentor. That was also for me really moving. Um, oh, I'm going to forget now. Jason Schiffer, our chief of police, who is someone who I knew before he came to Lehigh, just because I've lived in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania for 20 years, and he was chief of police for the city before he was chief of police at Lehigh. This is his retirement gig,
Mhm.
which is crazy. Um, his stories of what it's like to be a police officer, to do community police officer work, riding, being a bike officer, also really revealing, really interesting, going a little deeper about how to stay, how not to get cynical as a police officer, especially when you're
Yeah.
doing overnight shifts and things like that. And that story, that piece, is something that um, he's a different kind of police officer. He's definitely someone who, as a lawyer, represented like transgender youth and
Yeah.
bathroom cases in schools and things like that. Like the things that he's done, he doesn't, again, not a typical police officer trajectory. And
Yeah.
during the after the George Floyd's murder. And during the protest summer and all of that, he was very involved. And so we re-aired, we kind of reposted his interview
Yeah.
um, for people to kind of listen to that and hear that story as well. I think those are a few examples. I could go on,
Yeah,
but
no, absolutely.
I want people to listen to the broadcast to the podcast.
Absolutely. Yes, and the links here, but it's definitely something where the stories of your employee population are so captivating, and the way that you really kind of tease them out, and really work with some of the incredible experience that the employees of Lehigh University have had. Um, I mean, in terms of the culture at Lehigh University, how does the podcast showcase those values? Because it's something where the university, I mean, you really feel kind of like you're part of it in a way. So, speak a little bit to that if you can for a minute.
Sure. Um, So we have principles of our equitable community. We have core values. Our values include inclusion and equity. We are working to
Yeah.
be an anti-racist university.
Yeah.
So that's all certainly very important to us and a piece of our values. But also things like just a practicality, where we are a university where people roll their sleeves up and they do stuff. Like our students do stuff, and our faculty do stuff, and so do our staff. And so I think that is very much reflected, that piece of our pragmatism as an institution. We are kind of like a mid-sized private university. We're in the top 50 in the country by rankings, and but we only have about 5 or 6 thousand undergraduates. So we're kind of on the small
Yeah.
side in that sense. But a past president liked to say that we wrestled above our weight. And we actually have a
Love that.
nationally famous wrestling program. Our NCAA wrestling program is definitely bigger than would be for a size of an institution like ours. So that's
Mhm.
always very much like we're scrappy, we're pragmatic, and curious. Our employer brand is part of our university brand, which is you bring the passion and we provide the possibility. So that's something that I very much try to showcase and weave into our conversations about the opportunities that folks have had when they got here to, in some ways, create their jobs and to shape their path at Lehigh, just by raising their hands and saying, "I'll do it." That's a big piece of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can hear in each one of the interviews how passionate the employees are about their roles. It's
Yeah,
something where, it doesn't seem like it's uh, a university where, you're just kind of punching the time card. you
right.
know, it really seems like a culture where you're passionate and you're diving in and you're going for what you want. And so I think that's fantastic. You bring the passion, we
You
bring the
bring the passion,
possibility.
we provide the possibility. So I kind of melted that down, distilled it into where passion meets possibility, right? So
Yeah.
the brand value is the piece, you bring the passion, we provide the possibility. And I just said that's too long. It's where passion meets possibility. And I
Yeah.
do strongly still believe that. I mean, for me, I'm living it myself again, going
Yeah.
from um, the employee communications program we had 12 years ago and sort of what I've managed to create. Part of it is my inner core. I'm easily bored. I am always looking for the next shiny object. So
Right.
it's so funny. Like last week, I was like, maybe I should start a Twitch channel and I could do live employee news broadcasts.
Mhm.
Like maybe I should do that, or should I use YouTube? Like I'm always
Right.
thinking, like, what's the next place where my employees are? I have not started a TikTok, however. I just
Okay.
no TikTok
Okay,
for me
not
yet.
yet.
I'm
Not
not saying
yet.
never.
Not
The
yet, at
university has a
least.
TikTok. The admissions department
Yeah.
does a TikTok. So,
Yeah, absolutely, and I think it's something where, you really hear that passion in the podcast, through the way that you tell the stories and also how passionate the employees are about their career paths and their roles, and just kind of saying yes to what feels very much like a yes within themselves, right?
mhm. Yeah,
Um,
totally.
so it's fantastic. And in terms of the university community, students, professors, and the surrounding community, what have the wider benefits been in terms of telling these stories?
That is a great question, especially since lately, there have been a number of them, I think, Chief Schiffer, Mark Wilson, and then
Yeah,
the head of our Lehigh University Art Gallery, William Crow, who I also interviewed
yeah,
this season, who really interact a lot with our community, with in particular South Bethlehem. The south side of the city is where the university is,
yeah,
and then Adrienne Washington, also who is our director of community relations. She was another person who I interviewed. So those folks are out there in our community all the time,
yeah.
and so to have a conversation that I can share, where people in Bethlehem can listen and get a little bit more about that person. So when they see them on the street, when they interact with them in a meeting, Adrienne goes to so many meeting on profits and
Yeah.
all of that. And or William is, working on something at the art gallery, where he wants to bring the community in more. There's an opportunity for folks to hear a little bit more about the person, get to know them a little bit more before interacting with them, and hopefully that helps build that relationship. I'd say that's
Absolutely.
the main benefit. I haven't. I mean, every once in a while, someone out there in the wild will
Yeah.
mention it to me, but for the most part, what I'm hearing more is folks who already directly interact with those people, saying it helped them see a side of them they hadn't gotten to see sitting in a meeting with them. So,
Absolutely, and I think it's something where, hearing somebody's full story in their own words and coming from a place of curiosity and vulnerability is powerful, right? When you're sitting across from somebody in a meeting and nobody's really talking, you're listening to one person, or you're you know, doing your everyday job, right? And you're kind of busy being in it. It's something where it really widens your perspective in that way
Yep.
and
Yeah,
brings that human element of it into focus.
absolutely. Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. So, in terms of the podcast from a branded podcast perspective, because as you mentioned, you can listen to this podcast on multiple podcast directories here on Podbean. Um, what are some ways that you promote the podcast?
Well, every episode of the podcast gets included in an issue of The Spot, which is our e-newsletter.
Yes.
And that is why it's called the Spotcast, because my first thought was this will be a piece of content in our e-newsletter. So it lives out there on its own, but every employee gets pushed and, gets pushed the episode when it comes
Yeah.
out. So that, that's right away the main way. But then I also promote it out on our social media channels. So we have I created a brand called Work
Mhm.
Life Lehigh, and I can't take total credit for that because Duke University, sort of a role model there, they created their social media was working at Duke. So I created
Okay.
Work Life Lehigh,
Yeah.
and we have a Facebook page. We have a new employees Facebook group. We have a Twitter account. We have an Instagram account, and we also use our LinkedIn page, obviously, which isn't branded Work Life Lehigh. It's just Lehigh University. And
Yeah.
so I will put it out on those platforms, throughout the month or two. I
Yeah.
tend to spread it out. I look for I always either take a picture of my subject or get a picture from them, obviously.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to like do a pull quote and a picture and get it out there. Tag the person if I can, because they will then share it, and and it kind of goes from there. Um, those are the main ways, really. You know, I don't have budget to promote. Like I can't do
Yeah.
boosted posts and things like that. But those are the main ways. Yeah.
Absolutely. And what does success look like for the initiative? Because it's so niche in terms of the university employee community.
Yeah, yeah, that's a great question, and I think it's really important to look at your success in the context of your
Yeah.
right, your goals. So, it's funny, I presented a webinar about this podcast, recently, and one of the other presenters, uh, put up their numbers, and they were so big, and I was like, "Oh," and then I looked at how many employees they have, and I realized that their
Right.
numbers and my numbers were right on track in terms of, head count, because, it was basically, about 10 to 15% of their employees listen to an episode, and that's about where I am as well. So, and that's, again, it's not a huge number of people, but it's, I think, in the overall mix of things, that it's a good number. And again, the return on investment isn't necessarily that every single employee listens to every single episode. It's a little more
Yeah.
diffuse than that. And I love Tony Tse from Zappos, the late Tony Tse. He
Yeah.
said, you can't everything that's worth doing doesn't necessarily have a return on investment. What is the ROI on hugging your mom, right? So I'm not saying my podcast is as good as a hug from your mom, but but it does things that
If it is,
are
that's the quote.
that's right. Better than a hug from your mom. Listen to the podcast. No, uh, but uh, but I will say that if it reaches folks in a way that is a little deeper, but it's fewer people, that's still okay with me. And my boss doesn't seem to have a problem with that. He thinks it's awesome. So that's
Yeah.
good too. Making your boss happy is good.
Absolutely, and I think it's something where the way that people ingest media is different across the board, right? And
Yeah.
podcasting takes time for people to get into the habit of listening and subscribing and knowing when the next episode is going to come out and kind of building it into their routine. So, it's definitely something that is more of a marathon than a sprint.
Well
And
said.
yeah, and it's something where, some people are really going to resonate with a short blurb in a newsletter, and other people maybe on a commute or on a long walk, especially during peak COVID, when everyone's
Yeah.
wearing a mask and going outside by themselves in the forest on a walk. That's going to be a different experience. So I think it's important to diffuse that focus a bit across the employee spectrum, and I love the way that you phrase that.
Yeah, I mean, I just think that after, so many years of doing this particular kind of communications, you
Yeah.
realize it's like, I'm not gonna go viral, okay? And
Right.
viral for me is not the same as viral for, Coca-Cola or whatever. It's just that's not what I'm after.
Right, but I think that there's that you feel like almost like you're in a small town.
Mhm.
That's the feeling that I personally get from listening to the podcast. It's like, "Oh, I'm walking down the street and I'm running into this person. I'm walking down the street and I'm running into this person," because, it feels so, yeah, welcoming and kind of, like everybody knows each other and cozy and familiar in that way. So, the feeling is definitely there, and I think that's also probably part of the culture at Lehigh more than a larger organization as well.
Yeah, I hope we're conveying that, so I'm glad that you got it from it,
No,
so
we're
yeah.
getting it. Yeah. It's very clear from the podcast. So as season 2 continues on, because as you mentioned, season 1 launched, you had a couple of episodes out, and then COVID hit. And I think it's been so great probably, and I'm just, estimating here, but my assumption is that it's been great because while people are in our isolated moments and our isolated realities, there's still that feeling of connection and community that the podcast is conveying. Um, and you do speak candidly, about it and how, we're all home at this moment, or specifically what the situation is. And in season 2, you speak to different. Season 2 has just started to come out, which is pretty exciting. Um, but you speak to different employees about, kind of what their COVID experience has been with Levi. Um, some employees have started after COVID began. And so their entire experience so far as part of the university culture has been a digital one,
Yep.
or a mostly digital one, whatever the case may be. And so I think it's something where it's been really powerful. But as you move more into season 2 and you maybe plan more for the future of the podcast, what are some goals you have for this podcast moving forward?
Yeah, I still have a few more episodes in the can for this season,
Yeah.
and a couple more folks who I wanna interview, and so the focus of this season was, employees whose work has been what was directly impacted by the shutdown, in particular, what
Yeah.
their experience of 2020 was like. The ones I have in the can, I interviewed last summer, actually, before Delta. We went back into the
Yeah.
studio, we were, like, 6 inches from each other doing these interviews, and then
Wow.
we kind of had that sort of shutdown again in the semester. We had a big spike, and so
Yeah.
so even though I interviewed them a little while ago, the stories are
Yeah.
still very, very pertinent.
Relevant.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they're still all very relevant because we keep going through these waves and everything.
Yeah.
You can definitely look forward to more of these kinds of stories of folks. Elena Key, our chief technology officer, who when the world shut down, had to flip 1,000 classes to online, 1,000 classes.
Yeah. Just
That's how many sections of classes were going on our campus during the
yeah.
semester. Everybody went home, thought they'd be back in 2 weeks. Oh, we'll just do 2 weeks of virtual. So
Yeah.
talking about that, and then Jenna, who's our head of fitness, talking about how do you do fitness classes like when you've never done virtual fitness before, things like that. So there'll still be more of that. Um,
Yeah.
and I love conversation, and so I tend to do these single person interviews. Um, I am thinking about other formats for season 3 in terms of perhaps more things that would come out in closer to real time about topics. So we've got our flex place policy and our fully remote policy, and now we're working in all these different ways. Do we want to have some conversations about that? I might have more than one person in the studio for that kind of conversation.
Yeah.
I'm excited to say it looks like I've got an intern for next fall, so I will
Yes.
have that opportunity to
Yeah.
really bounce things off of another person and work on it. It's always great our journalism department is wonderful, and they have journalism and communication students, and they each have to do an internship as part of their degree, and
Yeah.
so some of them choose to do them within Lehigh, and we really benefit from that. They're just the smartest people, and just one brag. One the Emma, the student who helped me launch this podcast in fall of 2019, she has now gone on to a career in podcasts. So she's working in the podcast world,
Amazing.
um,
Oh,
and and like launching our
yes.
podcast was the reason why it was able to happen for her. And so I'm excited about that impact that we've had as well. So yeah, I am definitely thinking about some format changes, even though I love the longer format conversation and probably won't drop that. I'll probably just add a second podcast because that's what I do. You know?
Yeah, I wanna talk a bit about adding additional podcasts in a second, but I think the production quality is so beautiful, and I love what you said about your intern, really kinda jumping in and making her mark in podcasting. It's something that is a medium where, when the bug bites you, you just really you love it. All of us in podcasting are, it feels like such a personal medium, and we talk about this all the time at Podbean, right? You feel like it's you under the covers, or in your closet with a big blanket over you, with your microphone, like, "Hello, world," like a very kind of isolated experience, but podcasting is incredibly communal, incredibly social, whether it's from production to live in-person podcasting events to online forums to episode swaps, which a lot of podcasters outside of organizations, independent podcasters, will do. So it really is quite a social medium. And the way that stories are told, uh, and the way that we perceive audio is different than video or is different than print, right? Because, and especially nowadays in the world that we live in, especially with smartphones, because the same headphones that you are talking to your mom on are the same headphones that you're listening to a podcast on. So it feels intimate in a way.
It's very intimate, and I mean, I'm a public radio nerd from
Yes.
way, way back, and for
Yeah.
me, so Terry Gross was like the gold
Oh,
standard interviewer,
oh,
right?
I
So
love
I
Terry
just
Gross. I'm sorry.
right.
I'm just the
No, no,
biggest,
right? So I
biggest fan.
that's what I aspire to, where these
Yeah.
conversations where, yeah, you
Yeah.
have it in your ears and it's like the person's really in your head,
Yeah.
right? And I think one of the things that, um, I've benefited from was the fact that I have experience. I worked at a public television station. I've done on air, pledge drive, live pledge drive, things like that. So I was used to having heard my own voice, and maybe don't love it all the time, but I think those are things when
Right.
you're making a podcast, you think, oh, I hate my voice. And the people who
Right.
you interview will say, oh, I don't want to listen to it back, because I always let my employees who I interview listen to it before I put it out in the world. I want to make sure
Yeah.
they're showing
Before you
the
publish.
self that they
Sure.
want to show. Yeah, exactly. I'm not like a gotcha journalist. I always tell people when I interview them, I'm like, this isn't 60 Minutes. I'm trying to make you look good because you make us
Right,
look
of course, especially
good.
within the university. Oh gosh,
Exactly.
gotcha. Time
So,
for your
but everybody,
annual review. No.
nobody wants to have their picture taken, and nobody wants to hear their voice back, right?
Right.
Those are the two things people hate. Um, but I think that the quality of the studio that we have, and I try to create a relaxed atmosphere. People's voices show their personalities, and yeah, I love listening to in my earbuds as well. I'm the same way.
Yeah, absolutely. And what are some of the ways that you kind of prep the interviews and prepare questions?
Yeah, so my questions are fairly standard. I will look in a little bit to what the individual person's role is and things like that. But my standard sort of process is a pitch to them, and then if they say yes, we schedule a 15-minute pre-production conversation, and
Mhm.
that I kind of stole from talk shows, right? So talk show producers, they
Yeah.
always do a pre-interview to get stories, and to sort of prep the host of the talk show about what to ask the person, right? So I'm wearing all the hats. So I'll do a 15-minute conversation with them, and generally we've done those over Zoom for obvious reasons. And
Yeah.
they always want to know what the questions are going to be, and I always try as hard as I can not to tell them what the questions are going to be, because then they will rehearse answers. They'll write
Yeah.
things and memorize them, because people in general, you're not interviewing TV stars, you're not interviewing people who get interviewed all the time, right? So they're
Right.
nervous about it, and they want to um, feel articulate. So I always try to just give them very general ideas. We're going to talk about your career journey. I want to know more about you, and then talk about what you do. So I'm not going to tell them specifically that the first thing I'm going to ask them is, did you always, when you were little, did you want to be the director of a performing arts organization?
Right.
That's often the way I'll frame that first question, because usually the person will be like, no, I thought I was going to be an astronaut,
Right.
and so the conversation just gets rolling that way.
Yeah.
Um, so I think for me, it's important that they not be too rehearsed. And then when we get together and we sit down for the actual conversation, we talk a little bit beforehand. And I may start the recording a little ahead of time. And I tell them, okay, I'm going to do this little intro and blah, blah, blah. And then we're just going to have a conversation. And I do edit, I don't do it just live to tape and then air it. So there's room for them to start over if they fumfer, or say, oh, you know what, maybe don't include that. Or, if there's a long pause, I can cut it out. So,
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously you're going to show people in the best light possible, right? Or with the best editing possible. I don't know what the audio analogy there is, but I think I love that because, when we get the exact question or when there's something so specific, it's really easy to, kind of flub some perfect answer we have in our head that can either come off a little bit unnatural or a little bit overly wordy or over explanatory instead of natural. And so just really focusing on that natural voice is vital, in terms of showcasing those stories. And I mean, I love what you said about Terry Gross. For everybody watching, listening, she's the host of the radio show Fresh Air, which is like a cultural zeitgeist, I would say, in terms of interviewing across the spectrum, books, music, movies, politics, just, and the way that she interviews is very natural and the flow of the conversation feels very natural. So I love that that was your inspiration and you have that public broadcasting experience as well, kind of dovetailed with that. So that's really beautiful. I always wonder, how many people she's inspired with her
yeah,
interviewing
probably
and
a
the
lot.
style, right? It's so interesting, because some of the interviews, not to go off on a tangent, but they'll rebroadcast interviews sometimes, from 20 or 30 years ago, and her voice sounds different, and her interview style is a little bit different. And so it's as a podcaster, and I'm sure you can relate, right? Your first episode is different than the one you just put out. And so it's definitely something where it's a journey. And as podcasters, it's something where you have to let go of any preconceived notions that you're going to come out of the gate and be perfect or flawless
Right.
or
Right.
exactly. And even if you are, your concept and your show and the way that you produce it is going to change as well.
Absolutely, and I think that that's great advice for any kind of communication work that you do.
Yes.
When you're trying a new format, when you're trying a new content type, a new medium, just be prepared to kind of suck a little. It's okay, and people will forgive you. Most people won't notice most of what you think is like, oh, so cringy or whatever. And then eventually you get better at it, and that's the only way to learn stuff. And in communications, you have to stay relevant. You have to stay on top of all the new tools and the new
Yeah.
media. Um, and so you're just never going to be great at it at the beginning. Nobody is.
Right. And I think in terms of staying on the pulse of things, it's more important to get the information out there a lot of the time than to focus on being perfect. And of course, there are those times where that extra 3 hours of editing is worth it.
Yeah, you
But
have to pick your battles on that. I
right.
mean, video is a great example of that, right? Like,
Yeah.
sometimes a video can be, like a few photographs and a canned template, graphic kind of thing, and
Yeah.
get it out there, get it out there. And sometimes you want it to be like a 2-minute mini masterpiece, and you need to spend weeks on it. So you have to determine the level of um, investment that you need to make in any piece of content that you're going to make, and the podcast is like that also. And I do all my own editing now. Emma
Wow.
did the first few episodes, and then her
Mhm.
internship was done, and then COVID happened, and so now I do all the editing, and I do it on Audacity, which is a free software.
Yeah.
It's kind of a blunt instrument compared to something like Adobe Premiere Pro, which is what I use for video.
Yeah.
And each time I do it, I get anxiety because it's like, do I remember how to do this? Because I don't do them all at once. So the more you do something and the closer together you do it, the better, the less anxiety you'll have about it too. So
Yeah, absolutely, and you refine not only your skills, but your style as well.
yeah.
Um, and I love the intro of the podcast with the music and everything. So how did that kinda come into being?
Well, I mean, again, Terry Gross, other NPR, other public radio,
Yeah.
shows, you gotta have your intro music, you gotta, right?
Absolutely.
Um, so Emma and I, my intern and I, we went
Yeah.
on Pond 5, which is a
Mhm.
great source for inexpensive licensed music.
Yeah.
Um, and, we listened to a bunch of tracks, and that one just kinda it just spoke to us in terms of the
Yeah.
dynamic of it. And we just kind of figured out which one we wanted. Um, we did have a conversation with Pond 5 because we were putting this into a podcast, and we wanted to make sure we were paying at the right licensing level. It's important to pay
Yeah.
for your licensed music. Don't get in trouble.
Yes,
Um,
absolutely. We have a blog
and
post
so
about that as well, if you check out the
yeah,
Podbean
it's
blog.
very, very
Yeah.
important.
Yeah.
Um, and what's funny is, of course, it's a piece of licensed music, so it's out there in the
Yeah.
world. And one day I was watching a commercial, I was watching TV, and a commercial came on, and I heard my music in the background. I was like, that's
Oh,
my podcast
wow.
music. But yeah, and so, so you create that music bed, and you record that intro, and then you put
Yeah.
them together in your software, and save it as its own piece, and then you just tack it on at the beginning, each time, and so then, you know that when you go out of that, then start the live conversation. My guest today is, and all of that. But having that pre-recorded is handy, and I do think it's important to have like a signature um, piece of music that intros you, so it's kind of part of your brand and in your podcast.
Yes, absolutely. We had, Mark Rako, who's the head of audio at Linktree, speak on our larger corporate podcasting summit last year, and he signatures that was so interesting the way that he spoke about it because, your audience starts to kind of subconsciously and unconsciously respond to the specific signature, right? It's when we hear the same audio in a specific way every time, it further strengthens your relationship with your audience, but it also creates that, oh, I know what's next, right? And
Right.
that sense of familiarity and trust within your audience as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah. Great point. Absolutely.
Yeah. So I mean, this podcast is such a great show. And what we've noticed with a lot of organizations is that podcasting spreads. you know, Once one department or one person starts a podcast, everybody wants in. So tell us about some of the additional podcasting initiatives that are unrolling at Lehigh with the employee population, students, faculty, and what that looks like.
Yeah. I'm really proud of the fact that my podcast was really the first podcast by I think there may have been some student sort of interview things that were kind of a podcast, that the Brown and White, our student newspaper, did, but mine was the first of any done by like a staff or faculty member,
Yeah.
and it definitely, kind of had a had an impact, while I was in production and hadn't yet released our first episode. Development and alumni relations dropped me an email and said, "We heard you're doing a podcast. We're thinking of doing one. Can we meet with
Mm.
you and, compare notes?" So now they have a podcast, and it's called Go Getters. And it's a little different because it's obviously more focused on our alumni community and fundraising, those kinds of things. But
Mhm.
it started with the then president of the university being being the interviewer, being the host.
Mm.
And I think now the vice president of development is the host right now. And then some of the colleges got on board. So our College of Engineering, our College of Business, they both have podcasts now. Not sure about the other colleges. And so it's one of those things, when I started our e-newsletter like 10 years ago, I started getting emails from around campus. What are you using to do that? How do you make that look so nice? And then
Right.
I'd explain to them what I had done and all of these things. And I don't use a third party e-newsletter client. It's all done within Gmail and with our Drupal web system and things like that.
Yeah.
So it's a little homebrewed. And so the same thing has been happening with the podcast as well. And so I think COVID might have slowed things down a little bit for some folks, but I'm starting to get those emails again, and I'm delighted. Again, it's part of the Lehigh brand, right? It's part of our culture that we do homebrew things, that we do kind of put our nose to the grindstone, figure things out for ourselves, and then create things. And I want to let 1,000 podcasts bloom as far as I'm concerned. I mean, I do get a little jealous every once in a while if development snags someone that I wanted to interview, and then I think, can I interview them too? Or they'll interview someone I already interviewed, and I'll be like, oh my, I interviewed them already. So there's a little bit of
Right.
competition, but it's much more collegial than competitive. I think it's great. I encourage it. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think within the organization, it's so fun, to see how different departments tell, different stories. It's really something where it adds that human element and fills out the picture, I think, for a lot of different organizations.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, well, Hillary, it's been such a pleasure. Thank you
I
so
can't
much for
believe how
joining us
fast this
today.
went. Oh my
I
gosh.
know.
This went by
It
so
flew
fast.
by. Thank you again for joining us. For everyone who's joined us here live, this is Norma Jean Belenky. I'm the head of events here at Podbean, and we're joined today by Hillary Kwiatek, the employee communication specialist from Lehigh University. And today we spoke about why employee stories matter as part of our corporate podcasting smarter series. And if you have any questions, you can drop them here in the chat, or you can email us at podcastingsmarter@podbean.com. Podbean is a podcast hosting and monetization platform and home to over 640,000 podcasts. So if you have any questions, send us an email, hit us up. We're going to have the link to this podcast here in the description of our chat today. And Hillary, thank you again for joining us.
Thank you, Norma Jean. It was great.